stood in the center of the hall, the air thick with the scent of maple wood and settling dust. The floorboards groaned beneath her. Then the world shifted. Her perspective tilted upward as her body surged toward the vaulted ceiling. She looked down, but her feet were already retreating, shrinking into tiny points of reference miles below her gaze. "Curiouser and curiouser," she cried, her voice booming against the distant rafters, the sound returning to her as a hollow echo. She reached down, but her arms stretched like pulled dough, her hands feeling disconnected from the rest of her frame. She watched her toes grow smaller, imagining them wandering off on their own, perhaps needing a map to find their way back. A stray thought of sending them boots by carrier crossed her mind, a bizarre notion that sparked a frantic, breathless giggle. The hall felt like a cavern now, vast and indifferent. She was alone, towering over the silence, waiting for the ceiling to meet her head. A sharp thud echoed through the hole as her head struck the cold, unyielding ceiling. She was over 9 feet tall now, her frame wedged between the floor and the rafters. She reached for the golden key resting on the table, but her fingers were clumsy, massive, and far too slow. The garden door remained inches out of reach, a taunting sliver of light she could no longer access. Frustration surged, hot and heavy. She slumped against the wall, her knees drawing up to her chest, and the first sob broke free. It was not a quiet sound. It was a torrent. Salt water spilled from her eyes, pooling rapidly around her ankles. She watched the liquid spread, a shimmering, rising tide that turned the floor into a mirror. Within seconds, the water was 4 inches deep, swirling around her feet and soaking the hem of her skirt. The hall was no longer a room. It was a basin. The rhythmic pattering began as a faint vibration against the surface of the lake. Alice stilled her breathing, watching the ripples spread. A figure emerged, moving with a frantic, jerky gait. It was the White Rabbit. He held a fan in one hand and a pair of gloves in the other. His movements sharp and erratic. He did not look at the water. He looked only at the ground, his ears twitching with every step. "Oh, the Duchess will be savage," he muttered, the words clipped and high-pitched. Alice saw her chance. She shifted her weight, the water churning around her, and reached out a hand. Her voice came out thin and trembling. "If you please, sir." The effect was immediate. The rabbit stopped dead. His head snapped toward her, eyes wide and fixed on her massive, looming form. He did not wait for a second word. He dropped the fan and the gloves into the rising pool with a soft splash and spun around. His feet scrambled against the wet floorboards as he bolted back into the darkness. Alice watched him vanish, the silence rushing back in. The heat in the hall grew stifling. Alice picked up the discarded fan, waving it with slow, heavy strokes, but the air remained thick and stagnant. She needed to focus. She needed to remember who she was. She closed her eyes and began to recite her lessons, but the familiar lines fractured. Instead of history, her mind offered nonsense about crocodiles and the Nile. The words felt alien, sliding off her tongue like wet stones. Her voice sounded hoarse, vibrating strangely against the vaulted ceiling, echoing back to her as if spoken by a stranger. Then the sensation hit, a sudden sharp pull in her midsection. The floor seemed to rush away, and the walls stretched upward, expanding into the gloom. She was shrinking. The process was violent and fast, a dizzying drop in perspective that made her grip the fan until her knuckles ached. Her limbs felt light, then heavy, then entirely uncoordinated. She tried to steady herself, but her center of gravity shifted wildly. She dropped the fan, her height dwindling until she was barely 2 feet tall, left to stare up at the vast empty expanse that now threatened to swallow her whole. The door stood ahead, a sliver of light in the dim hall. Alice scrambled toward it, her small feet finding no purchase on the slick, wet surface. She reached out, fingers straining for the handle, but the wood was cold and unyielding. Her balance faltered. Her left foot slid outward, and in an instant, the world tilted. She tumbled forward, arms flailing, and hit the water with a heavy, jarring splash. The impact knocked the breath from her lungs. She plunged deep into the pool, the salt water stinging her eyes and burning her throat. It was freezing, a sharp, biting cold that numbed her skin instantly. She kicked her legs heavy and uncoordinated, fighting to push back toward the surface. Bubbles rose past her face as she clawed at the murky depths. Her head broke the surface and she gasped, a ragged, desperate sound that echoed against the distant walls. She treaded water, her limbs aching with the effort of staying afloat. The pool was vast, an endless expanse of salt and shadow. She was no longer just a visitor in this hall. She was a swimmer in a sea of her own making, fighting to keep her head above the tide. She paddled through the salty expanse, her hair matted against her neck. A small, dark shape bobbed nearby, moving with rhythmic, nervous strokes. Alice squinted through the gloom. It was a mouse, its whiskers twitching in the dim light. She reached out, hoping for guidance. "Oh, mouse, do you know the way out of this pool?" she asked, even attempting a fragment of French to sound polite. The mouse stopped paddling. Its small eyes narrowed and its body stiffened. Alice, sensing the silence, tried to bridge the gap. "I beg your pardon, but perhaps you would like my cat, Dinah. She is quite excellent at catching mice." The effect was instantaneous. The mouse shivered, its fur bristling, and it let out a sharp, indignant squeak before diving under the surface. Alice scrambled to correct herself, shouting about dogs, but that only made the water churn more violently. Suddenly, the air above the pool filled with sound, a heavy splash, then another and another. A dodo, a duck, and an eaglet plummeted into the water, creating a chaotic spray that soaked her face. The pool, once a lonely trap, was now a crowded, bobbing assembly of frantic creatures. Alice grabbed a stray feather and began to swim toward the distant dark edge of the hall. The water shallowed until her feet scraped against grit and mud. Alice waded forward, the heavy sodden weight of her movement finally giving way to solid ground. She pulled herself up the bank, gasping as she collapsed onto the damp earth. Behind her, the dodo, the duck, and the eaglet hauled themselves out, shaking their wings and sending a spray of salty water into the air. The assembly stood, shivering in the dim light of the hall. The mouse crawled onto a flat stone, its face pale and set with a grim, serious expression. It cleared its throat, the sound sharp and commanding. The creatures gathered close, forming a tight, expectant circle. The mouse looked at Alice. Welcome to Giggle Bus TV. Like, share, and subscribe to Giggle Bus TV.